Hello interwebs, I hope you're doing well, and before we get started, since this is the first video that I'm actually recording in the month of June for this channel, I just want to say happy Pride to everyone in the LGBTQ plus community. I am so proud to be a member of this community, and I just absolutely love and adore you, so love to all of you, love to you who aren't in the community as well, but especially to those of you who are. I hope that while not everything has been great for the LGBTQ community, especially as of late, I just want to celebrate the fact that this community is beautiful and wonderful, and I am so proud to be a part of it. But on that note, this segue doesn't really naturally flow, but you know, I'm queen of transitions. I can do transitions. Let's do it. Today I'm going to be talking about Mistborn, the book by Brandon Sanderson. I know I am 15 years late to this party, and I also don't normally do book reviews on this channel, but I just recently got into this series, and I am honestly so excited to talk about it. I just needed a place to vent about it. Also, considering the fact that quite literally the day that I finished reading Mistborn was the day that Fortnite, of all things, announced that one of the main characters, Kelsier from the books, is going to be in Fortnite now, and Brandon Sanderson is teasing like some big announcement on the future for this series. I'm just saying I willed it into existence. It's all because of me. You can thank me for it. But that being said, it looks like we're about to hit a Mistborn sort of resurgence, I guess, even though it's like a 15-year-old series that is just now sort of getting broader attention. But yeah, I think I'm glad to have gotten in on the trend right before it seems to explode into the mainstream, as it seems set to do in the near future. And I just want to gush about this book so much. And so, since book reviews are somewhat new for the channel outside of a Star Trek context, I'm going to be doing this review in a sort of different structured way. I'm going to have a spoiler-free section up front where I'm going to talk about all the things that I loved about this book and try to convince all of you who may not have read the book, may not have been interested in the book, or may not even have heard about it, interested in reading it. I'm going to just gush at you about how much I loved this book. And then the second half of the review is just going to be me talking about some of the spoiler stuff that I just want to gush about and talk about, especially since I'm just now starting the second book in the series. And so I just sort of want to have a little time capsule of like, oh, me being excited about this book and not having read the rest of the series. And maybe I'll be able to look back on this and sort of be able to talk about it. So I think this is a unique place in both the Mistborn sort of series as a mainstream thing, as well as my fandom of it. And I sort of want to talk about it while I have this like weird moment in time here on this channel. So let's get into the spoiler-free discussion. I have never read a Brandon Sanderson book up until now, which is honestly kind of surprising because I have heard of him. He's basically probably the most prominent fantasy author that has not had sort of a big adaptation in media, though that seems like it's going to be changing. So I'm honestly surprised that I haven't really gotten into any of his books yet, and Mistborn seems like it's one of the most accessible. It's sort of sitting in this really interesting space where it is very much like kind of an adult fantasy novel. There's some really dark stuff in here, some really dark stuff as well, and yet also it kind of sits in the YA space as well, the young adult space, because we have a very young protagonist, Vin, as sort of the main character, the entry point into the series. She's sort of growing up, learning about the world. She's, you know, a young adult. I think she's 16 at the start of the first book. There's a little bit of romance in this novel as well. So it sort of like sits in this like interesting middle space where like if you're an adult and you want some adult science fiction, or sorry, fantasy, this definitely has that. This goes to some dark places. And yet, it's also just accessible for YA audiences as well. It never gets so dark. It kind of sits in like a PG-13 realm, where it's like a little bit subversive for YA, but adult enough for adults to sort of get into, and I really appreciated that. Jumping off of that, let me talk about the setup of this world, because I feel like the setup of this world is actually really unique. This world is set where the bad guy won. You know, the Dark Lord Sauron has taken over the land. He is in control. In this show, they call him the Lord Ruler, and he has sort of pressed everyone into this what he calls the final empire. You know, there's a group of slave people, there's a group of nobles, and sort of everyone falls into those two groups. But what's interesting about this setup is that the Lord Ruler has set himself up as a god, and almost to a degree, rightfully so, considering that there is this myth that may or may not be true that thousands of years ago he saved the world from something. And so he was that sort of big hero that we see in fantasy novels. He saved the world. And yet, after that fact, he turned dark. He was able to live forever, and he turned evil and sort of corrupted it. So that's such an interesting subversion on this idea. And all of the nobility in this world are his descendants of his friends from that time. And so there's like interesting class structure going on here. And that's something too, as someone who is a big leftist, and that's not a main focus of the book, but there's definitely a lot of discussion, and a lot of nuanced discussion of class and class distinction, slavery and dynamics, and talking about like who gets to be nobility, how nobility view people who are slaves, how slaves view themselves. And sometimes it's hard to sort of break out of that mindset when you've been oppressed for so long, but then there are people that want to break out of that oppression, and sort of dealing with that brainwashing, the sort of horrors of fascism in a society like this, and breeding programs, and trying to make sure that people don't get certain genetics, kind of dealing with the fantasy system. So just a wonderful, like, interesting setup for the world here. The other thing too with the world is this magic system. This is a hard magic system, which means that the rules of this magic system are very much set in stone, as opposed to something like Lord of the Rings, where like Gandalf can sort of do whatever he wants, and that's called like a soft magic system. This is like, there are very set rules for this magic system, and the book, at least especially book 1, is very much about exploring how this magic system works. Basically, this concept is that people have the ability to have certain powers when they ingest certain metals. Certain people can only ingest like a specific type of metal. Like, for example, if you eat tin, people who are able to use the tin metal can have heightened hearing, can have heightened physical abilities. People who burn pewter, for example, can also like push and pull metals and be able to jump off of metals and things like that. But most people who have this ability, and it's only a few people that can only use one different metal in their entire lifetime. So only one. Some people, called Mistborn, which our main character Vin is, can use all of the different metals, which makes them extremely powerful and extremely rare. Again, Brandon Sanderson does such a great job setting up the specific rules of how each and every one of these metals works. Like, you know the limits and the extremes and how each of these things work within this world. And yet, when he explains it, I'm someone who loves exposition in novels. Like, I will sit here and have a magic system explained to me all day long. Like, anyone who loves lore dive videos, that's what this book does. But what Brandon Sanderson does such a great job of is mixing in the explanations of this magic system, the exposition of it, tying it in with emotional moments and beats within the story. I was just so excited that whenever there was like a cool explanation, there was always something emotional going on within this. Like, for example, when we sort of learn about the ability of one of the metals, it's tied into a character sort of revealing his past and how it tied in with his love of his life and his love betraying him at one point in his life. And so there's always something emotional going on, even within the exposition of the novel. And that's always a hard line to toe, especially when you have such a very rule-driven world. And so to Brandon Sanderson for doing that is just huzzah. Getting into the plot of this novel, though, is basically the ways I can best describe this is grand fantasy heist, which I am so excited about. I heist movies are some of my favorite movies. I love the meticulous planning and plotting, and that fits in sort of Brandon Sanderson's very like rules-oriented style. But the basic idea is the main character of this book, or one of the main characters, Kelsier, is this guy who wants to destroy the Lord Ruler. He has a personal vendetta against the Lord Ruler, which I won't spoil here. You sort of learn it as the book goes along. And he wants to basically do a heist. He's a thief, and he wants to use what he can do, his thieving powers, and he forms a crew together to try to bring down the entire empire through a single heist, through something like a specific action. And again, how that gets explained is a lot more fun, so I don't want to spoil it too much here, but it's just a cool concept to sort of say, like, we can do a heist story, which usually are like smaller in scale, and yet build it out into a grand fantasy narrative. It's such a unique take. It's not necessarily we're going to fight the bad guy. It's sort of we're going to try and do something subversive, something on the down low to try to break in, to destroy this empire. Such a cool idea, and it makes total sense within the world, but how that gets explained, the twists and turns as it goes, are just so much fun. There's so many ups and downs and dips and valleys, but you all feel like you're progressing towards the end goal of this throughout the entire plot, and you really feel like when they lose hard, and it's difficult to read, but then you sort of feel like, oh, but they can do this now. Such wonderful, like, oh, they've been defeated, but maybe not. Such great sort of like plot usages and pacing throughout this entire first novel. I was overjoyed with that. The characters in this are also some of my personal favorites in all of fantasy. I've already mentioned Kelsier. He is the character that got added to Fortnite, and he is one of the main characters. I mean, Vin, the sort of young girl, is our lead character, and she sort of goes into the future books as I've started book 2 now. I'm just a few chapters in. But Kelsier is sort of like the one that everyone sort of hinges upon, and really people love him. He's sort of the thief with like the rugged past, the sort of chip on his shoulder, but a very good man at heart. Kind of an archetype, but I really like how they sort of subvert him in a very interesting way, because there's a few things that this book does where it sort of plays on that trope of, like, again, we had that hero, the Dark Lord, the Lord Ruler from this book, who was that guy who he was supposed to be the good guy, but then took a dark turn at some point in the history. And Kelsier kind of almost seems to mirror that in an interesting way. He is someone who is, he's full of himself a little bit. He feels like he can take down the Lord Ruler. He is a good man, but maybe he thinks a little bit too highly of himself. Maybe he might actually use his powers and get too full of himself and might use his powers for bad, or sort of ignore, get so wrapped up in his own mythos that he might get distracted by stuff. And I love that theme. I love that subversion of the main character. Then we also have the character of Vin, who is much more the sort of stereotypical YA protagonist, but I love that there are things in this novel that Brandon Sanderson does that are sort of typical of YA stuff, like romance and things like that, but does it in a way that does not bother me as much as it would normally, or feel as stereotypical as would be normally in a young adult novel like this. If you can consider this a young adult novel, or at least young adult like. Vin is very much a character. She grew up as like a street urchin sort of character. She has a little bit of chip on her shoulder, and the whole book is about her learning to trust, her learning to believe that there is good in the world, and finding that might actually be the case in a world of so much darkness. You can find good. And for someone who's a big Trekkie who loves that sort of idea of, like, even in the darkest of times we can find light, that's a theme that will always resonate with me, with characters finding love, finding care, finding kindness, but never losing sight that dark stuff does happen. That's always the hard line to toe within novels like this. It can feel overly optimistic or overly dour. But again, this book walks that line so wonderfully. The other thing, too, is the romance in this novel. I saw some other reviews when I was sort of like looking into reading this novel that knocked the romance, but it worked for me in an interesting way here, because it is very much so like, she gets wrapped up. Vin, sort of one spoiler, her role in the plot for some part of the book is that she has to go into the noble society, pretend to be a noble, something that she has never done before. And she starts getting wrapped up in it. And so she's sort of like this, I'm a thief, I can go and do these cool things. And she sort of gets wrapped up in the balls and like wearing pretty gowns and very stereotypically girly things. And that would bother me. It's like, oh, you're going to stick your girl in sort of very girly things. It's like, oh, I love wearing dresses. But I love, again, Sanderson sort of like toes this interesting line down the middle of like, she never loses sight of like, she's a badass assassin girl who like likes to, fight back and jump around and sneak around rooftops at night. I also like that subversion of like, she also gets interested in pretty dresses. And as someone like me who like, I like to fight back against the patriarchy and also look pretty while doing it, I liked that development of her character. It was, it feels like it could go stereotypical, like, oh, I love wearing the pretty dresses now, but it never goes that far. The romance, too, as I hinted at, also worked for me, because she falls for the guy very, very quickly, which is, again, very much a young adult trope. I was like, oh, pretty man, I'm going to get interested in him. But unlike other books, there's an interesting push and pull between these two, where it feels realistic. She is young, and so she would fall for this guy. And yet he's also kind of using her, but then he starts to notice her right when she starts to get less interested in him. It just feels like a very natural ebb and flow in the romance, that it's not just like, oh, I fall for him, and then he falls for her, or there's like not completely unrequited, but there's ebbs and flows for both of these characters that feel natural, that sort of makes it even more satisfying when they do potentially come together towards the end. I won't say how or what or how that plays out, but it ebbs and flows so wonderfully. The only thing I'll mention in the spoiler-free section is the ending. The ending of this book is such a thrill ride. The entire book is paced incredibly well, but the last, like, fourth of this book or so, fifth of this book, once things start going off, it's like, oh my gosh, I did not expect that to happen. Like, oh my, how is this going to get fixed? How is this going to, like, the final fifth, so much gets revealed, so much gets earned and paid off. It is so fantastic. And the other thing, too, is I will say, while this is the beginning of a 3-book series, as well as it ties into sort of a larger mythology as well as several other books that I haven't read yet, the ending of this book, despite all of that, the ending of this book feels complete. It feels like if you just want to read just this book in this series, You could, and feel satisfied by where this book ends. It's like, oh, that's a good story. But there's one little piece. There's one little piece at the end. You're like, like Brandon Sanderson's like, it's something that's been going on in the background, sort of like a nice, it's not the main thrust of the plot, but you're like, I wonder what that is. And there's a hint towards what it is right at the end. Not so much that it's like, oh, here's sequel T. It's just like, oh, but did you this thing could also be interesting if you really think about it. That might be an interesting little tidbit. And you're sort of like, oh, I know I could end here, but I want to know more. And that's why I immediately started book 2 right after this. And again, I'm only a few chapters in, but I just had to know. But also, you don't have to. If you're someone who just like wants a single book to read and, can sort of end it there, you can. And I think that is perfectly legitimate, and you will be fully satisfied by this novel. But if you sort of get wrapped up in the world, wrapped up in the characters, and are sort of interested in this one little plot piece that is off to the side, that isn't necessarily the driving thrust of the plot, but you're like, yeah, that is interesting. I wonder what that was about. Then that's there for you as well. So overall, such a great book. But let's dive into spoilers really, really briefly. Like I said, I'm going to sort of talk briefly about spoilers. I'm not going to go full bore into it because this review has already been long enough. But I just want to sort of capture this moment, having not read book 2 as fully yet, to sort of talk about spoilers. So if you haven't read the book, go read it and then come back for the spoiler section. All right, full spoilers here. Kelsier dies, and I kind of figured that was going to be the case, that with this novel, like he seemed like the mentor character who would pass away at some point, but I just love the way Sanderson does it and subverts it. The fact that this whole idea of like, he is sort of setting himself up to be this godlike figure in opposition to the Lord Ruler, and yet Kelsier sacrifices himself as a martyr, and makes himself a martyr for the cause. It's such a great little subversion of this trope, and I thought was just such a brilliant move, and also enabled one of the big problems that you get in with this sort of thing is the sort of like savior character. I mean, obviously, when we put that into a racial context, when we're talking about slavery, you can't really fully divorce it, even in a fantasy context, when we have some sort of racial themes going on here, even though it's sort of something that you can place onto this if you're thinking about it. So having this sort of savior trope is, especially written by a white author, can get problematic. And I'm not saying that that's not here, because there is definitely a savior character sort of thing going on with Kelsier, but I like that the end of this enables the Ska, who are the slave people in this series, enables them to have much more agency. And yes, they are, doing it on the back of like Kelsier's martyrdom, but they have the agency in the finale of this story. Vin, who is also Ska, is someone who has the agency in the end of the story and gets to defeat the Lord Ruler. And I just deeply, deeply enjoyed that like little twist on this and sort of allowing it in. Again, there's probably some problems here to be said about the savior type trope, because it is still here. But I just thought that was so wonderful. And I talked about this earlier, but I love the discussions of class here. That Vin sort of at one point in the book throws back at the crew that she's working with. She's like, you are not Ska. Yes, you are not the nobility, but you are basically nobles. You've never lived the life of a slave. You've never lived as one of the lower class people in this world. So you're just nobles of a different name. And I love that sort of understanding of the nuance of how class works gets brought up in this world. And it's not so clearly, distinctly easily stratified as it initially appears. And I think that again, such a brilliant understanding of the nuance of the way the world in his own world works, and the way the world works in the real world by Brandon Sanderson. So really great subversion there. The ending of this novel, like I said, I love that the Lord Ruler gets killed. It's over. The Empire falls. Like, that's a great ending. It's like, oh, okay, it's done. But then you get that little twist of like, well, what was the thing that he saved the world from before? And might it come back? And there's a few other niggling sort of problems, like what are the myths that are permeating on this world? Things like that. And I'm just like, that was not the focus of this. And it's just sort of in the background. But you're just sort of like, oh yeah, that is an interesting question. It's just so smart to make you feel satisfied and yet intrigued to know more with the next book. And just like I said, I picked up the second book the very next day because I was just so excited to get into it. So yeah, overall, this book is phenomenal. I cannot recommend it enough. I am so excited to see if there is going to be some sort of adaptation of this, whether it be a movie, book, or movie, TV show, or video game. I'm actually kind of hoping for a video game. I feel like we've only really had The Witcher, sort of like a major fantasy series that sort of got its first adaptation in video game. And I would love to see, especially with the Fortnite thing going on here, I would love to see this series become a video game, because I feel like that actually might be the place where it would get the most usage. I think you can do a lot of stuff with the magic system. It sort of naturally fits into a video game context in a lot of interesting ways that I would very much be interested to see how this story got adapted as a video game. But if we also get a movie or a TV show, I'm here for that as well. But I think video games actually might be the most interesting type of adaptation for this. So overall, so excited. Cannot recommend this enough. Also, as we wrap out here, I would love to know your thoughts on Mistborn, but I would also love to know your thoughts on me doing more book reviews on this channel. I cannot become like a booktuber. I can't read that fast. I have so many other things that I'm doing. So I don't necessarily have time to do like a book a week or a book review a week or things like that. But I would be more willing to do it on a more regular basis if people were interested in that. So if that is something that you would be interested in, please let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on potentially doing more book reviews on this channel outside of just the Star Trek novels that I've been reviewing. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. I'd love to have you subscribe to this channel. I also have a main channel where I do more video essays called Jessie. You can subscribe over there. I also have a Patreon page where you can help support me doing what I do, because this is my full-time job, and Patreon really helps me pay the bills. In fact, it distinctly helps me pay the bills. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and stay sexy.